Hello, welcome to the Viewpoint. I am Mamadou Mbodj. As we all know, the coronavirus is ripping through the world, leaving a trail of socio-economic crisis, problems, difficulties. God knows how long it will take for us to solve this crisis. So far, around the world, more than 4 million people have contracted the disease and more than 280,000 have died. Right here in Africa, we've got more than 60,000, 63,000 and more who have contracted the disease, and more than 2,200 or so. The numbers keep going up because it's an evolving picture. According to the WHO Africa Region's director, while COVID-19 likely wouldn't spread as exponentially in Africa as it has elsewhere in the world, it is likely to smolder in transmission hotspots. COVID-19 could become a fixture in our lives for the next several years, unless a proactive approach taken by many governments in the region. We need to test, trace, isolate, and treat. And we all know that right now around the world, many countries, all of them are in crisis. We depend on these donor nations. So, whilst these nations have their own crisis, what realistic support can we expect from them? Here to help me answer that question is the EU ambassador to the Gambia, Mr. Attila Layosh. Welcome to the Viewpoint.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
You're welcome. The pleasure is all ours. Just as I've said in the intro, I mean, of course, through your EDF, you've been supporting the Gambia, Africa a lot. But right now, in Europe, you are now in trouble. What realistic support, help can we really expect from the EU right now?
Thank you for your question, and I was very careful listening to your intro. Indeed, it's true. We are confronted with something unprecedented, not only in the sense of the health crisis, but also in the sense of the complexity and depth of the consequences, socio-economic consequences of it. The European Union has been, since the beginning, very firm in its belief that for this global pandemic, only a global response could really help. And that's why the European Union, in spite of the fact that member states and the Union itself was deep in the crisis regarding the spread of the transmission of the pandemic in Europe, but made a big revision as to see how we can get over with this. And it is important to underline that in spite of the circumstances in Europe, the European Union managed to come up with a global response, because we firmly believe that only collectively could we really win this fight. That means several things, and I do not necessarily make priority when I highlight a few aspects, but obviously the first aspect of intervention was to provide support to partner countries, not only European Union member states, but our many partners around the globe, including, of course, on the continent of Africa and more specifically the Gambia, to help them to the crisis response in the health sector, the spreading, the transmission of the pandemic, the handling of the cases, whereas at the same time to look at what we could do to help build their capacities in terms of national health system, in terms of sanitary hygiene standards, but also, last but not least, to see and look at what support could we provide to them in terms of mitigating the consequences of the impact or socio-economic impact of the pandemic in the country. And this is what really included in the very global response the European Union is offering to the whole world, and also more specifically in the Team Europe package for the Gambia. I think in this regard we also have to be very clear on things like this is a challenge which we never faced before. The world never been in such a deep economic crisis ever since the crisis back in the 1930s. And I think this shows how serious the situation we look at. I truly believe that what we are campaigning for from the European Union side, to join efforts, to be in solidarity and unity in our complex response to the COVID pandemic and its consequences, is really somewhat symbolic as to what the European Union has always been. May I just...
But that joint effort, how has it been? Have you been able to mobilize?
Indeed.
Because especially when we hear what's coming from the US and with President Trump regarding the WHO, so you can hear certain disunities, as it were, around the world.
Well, the European Union was one of the first great actor in the globe, who announced right at the beginning, back in March, that we are fundamentally supporting the work of the UN family as a whole, but particularly regarding the crisis response, the health response, support to the WHO. We truly believe that they are the lead actor in the fight, especially in the component of the health crisis. I am not here to comment on other countries' policies. One thing is sure, if you look at history, isolation policies never really worked. And we had many instances where certain countries applied isolation policies, but at the end it didn't work and they changed. Now, we do believe that the response got to be proportionate to the danger, to the threat. You asked the specific questions, what could we effectively deliver under these circumstances? I am very proud to announce that I think we can deliver quite substantially. What happens is that back in March we started a revision of each and every single intervention, assistance, project, whatever form it was, to look at what could we reorientate to assist the Gambia in its efforts to fight the pandemic. What are those funds unused, reallocatable, in order to put them in a sector where we could support more. And last but not least, we also looked at possibilities of what was planned in terms of budgetary support, for example, and we made necessary arrangements to front load those supports which were foreseen later this year or even 2021. So in fact, in the past couple of weeks, I think your viewers and listeners, they could read a lot of press releases from the European Union delegation in the Gambia, because once we had a completion of a project revision, so we could so-called COVIDize it, we came out, of course, with a press release to show the country, the people, and there comes the European Union, and we have every intention to complement the government's efforts, the country's efforts in fighting this pandemic. The front-loading of the €9 million budgetary support, for example. If you allow me, I would refrain from figures, because I think for the ordinary citizen, figures are far too much high.
In fact,
but I think it's important to give it in a context, like the COVID fund, which the government initially allocated for fighting the health crisis. 500 million.
That's not talking about the $500 million.
Indeed, this €9 million, which comes after
different,
that,
separate from that one.
It's a separate from that one, and it's slightly more than that one, which gives the government a fiscal space for replenishment of the fund as it comes necessary. I think it's important. If we look at technicalities, the speed with which this front-loading of a budgetary support was eventually achieved is a record, even within EU practice, to have such a financial transaction done in such a short time. And
is it given in one lump sum, or is it the benchmarks? Because we know the normal. How does it work?
It is €9 million cash from treasury to treasury, and it already landed on the 30th of April in the bank account of the Gambian treasury. So it's already in country. Yes. It's cash.
Is there any monetary role? Do you have any monetary role over this, how it is spent and where it is spent?
Of course, with every project intervention, regardless of the formula, we do have a very strict monitoring, and the same goes for budgetary support. On the other hand, you mentioned benchmarks, jointly established objectives. These are maintained. But on the other hand, this front-loading was without conditionality, in the sense that we did not didn't do the disbursement in bits and pieces. We front-loaded the whole 9 million. This is also under the framework of the contract, so-called State Resilience Building Contract. And I think as long as the Gambia remains on track regarding democratic transition, I don't really see much of problems coming regarding eventual disbursement of budgetary support in the future. We will have a bigger chunk of budgetary support, 22.5 million euro, again in one disbursement, sometime in August. It is foreseen.
Okay, all right. But do you see any transparency in the way this money is spent? Because we know that we hear from local journalists that we're not really getting specific, when we ask specific questions, you're not really getting specific answers. You're getting generalities. How much control do you have in seeing where each euro is going? To have this itemized auditing, as it were.
Sure. Thank you for the question, because I think transparency and accountability is increasingly important, especially under such crisis circumstances. Let me answer your question by saying that the budgetary support, how it works, needs to be kept in mind. We don't give the money for the government to achieve something, to do something. We disburse the money once the government achieved the objectives we jointly established. And from that on, it is entirely up to the government to decide how they're going to spend it. Of course, in this expenditure, they have to comply with the local rules and regulations regarding good public finance management. At the same time,
but there isn't much that you can do in that sense. There's where it stops. You stop somewhere.
Speaking, we agreed on a contract. We agreed that you're going to achieve certain things, and once you achieve that, we disburse the money, and then it is up to you to use it for the needs of the different aspects of your governance. On the other hand, I would like to underline the important role all the controlling mechanisms play in the country. Investigative journalism, National Assembly scrutiny, or audit office, or whatever instruments you may have. In that sense, of course, the maturing civil society in the country, maturing journalism plays an important role. If you just look at what's happening at the National Assembly these days, you can't compare the activity of the National Assembly now these days compared to 4 years ago. So these are, for us, from an EU perspective, also assurances that the government spending, the execution of the different financial supports the government receives, because it's not only the European Union providing financial assistance, is actually scrutinized.
So you scrutinize all of that, and so far your relationship with the government, you've seen that they've been adhering to good practice, good financial management as far as the EU is concerned.
Yes, I can confirm that. As a matter of fact,
and any shortcomings?
As a matter of fact, we had budgetary disbursements in the past years when not the entire amount of the foreseen budgetary support was disbursed, due to reasons that certain benchmarks were not achieved. And this was no surprise. When a benchmark is not achieved, there may be many different contributing factors, not necessarily fraud or mismanagement of funds, in which case that component of the budgetary support was not disbursed. Under these circumstances, however, we got to be also very clear on what we do and how we do it. Whereas we have a contract as a basis for all budgetary support, under the current circumstances with the disbursement of the 9 million euro, I do believe the European Union did right to make it as easily achievable as possible, in the sense that the aim was to disburse the money to help the government have the financial space in order for them to organize their tremendous efforts in the fight against the transmission of the pandemic.
So now it's up to us how we spend it.
Absolutely. After all, this is a partnership, and I think it's extremely important what you said, because in a partnership which is based on common values, joint interest, mutual respect, I do believe this is not for us to tell the government what to do. After all, we have a government democratically elected, representing the people. They have a program, they have a national plan, development plan, they have a COVID plan. I think they know what needs to be done.
That is true, but again, you would perhaps forgive us, if you like, for being quite cynical sometimes with our governments. Corruption rampant. You talk to the average person, that's what the person will tell you. When it comes to strategies and policies, beautifully written and all the rest of it, but the implementation, that is an issue. So that's what ordinary people think about, even going to the extent of being cynical. Whatever money you give them, they will think that they wouldn't spend it where they should. Mm-hmm. They would go to nest their own feathers. If you
Frankly
like.
speaking, this is how you got to be, because I do believe media, journalism plays an important role in holding any government to account. And I think that's also important, and we, from the European Union, we have been supporting civil society journalism in the country to make sure that it matures together with the changes in the regime, and there is a good balance, checks and balances, how a democratic country should operate. Don't get me wrong, I'm not minimizing the threat posed by corruption or mismanagement of funds. This is a serious issue, and should there be confirmed cases of such, and should that reach a certain degree, I think that would certainly have very negative consequences. As far as I see it now, I think there is time perhaps for a very robust anti-corruption activity by all the different players in government and outside as well. I understand the government has been scheduling anti-corruption commission to be established.
But it hasn't been established yet.
Indeed, and I think the earlier, the sooner it is established, the better for the healthy development of the Gambian democracy.
Absolutely, and I was just going to come back to our earlier point. You see, how we see, for instance, the European Union or other international agencies, because of diplomacy, because after all, be it the EU, be it any other international agency, even where you have dictatorships, those people doing whatever, you still have these missions in there. So it seems because of diplomacy, you can just work with anybody. We've had sanctions, of course, even in the Gambia, so often, once in a while you would react, you would respond, but generally you would work with any governments. So, because look at it, we've been getting aid for God knows how long. The situation has hardly moved. What is going on? And you're compromised by that.
Indeed, the EU-Gambia partnership dates back to over 4 decades. If you look at this historical time span, quite obviously one can say that half of this time was under a very specific regime, the Jammeh regime. But if you also look at the figures in the sense of effective cooperation, in the sense of real development assistance coming to the country, not only humanitarian aid, but more, one may very easily establish the fact that during the 22 years of the Jammeh regime, the European Union assistance was kept on a rather modest level. And that was, of course, important to maintain diplomatic ties, because after all, you had 2 million people still living in the country, so it was important to maintain ties and connections with the country and deliver some support. On the other hand, if you look at the past 4 years, the past 3 years.
From 2017, since
the last presidential election.
Yes.
This is also something unprecedented in the EU-Gambia history, if I may say so. A relationship has never been so deep, so comprehensive, and in terms of figures, so big. It's not only about the exact figures of amount of euro you deliver, but this 365 million euro as a whole, which was the EU assistance overall to the Gambia under the current multi-financial framework, this is unprecedented. And I think this also shows what is the difference between a partnership where the European Union is collaborating with a democratic government and what is the difference when the government is a different one, which was the past. I can to some extent compare, because I arrived end of January 2016. So I have been here for 4 years, 3 months and 14 days, including today. And my first 10 months back in 2016 could not really mean and result in much of collaboration. Since the changes, this is totally different. The engagement by Gambian partners, state actors, non-state actors, the whole population, so to say, is amazingly overwhelming. It's indeed a challenge also for us to see how best to decide which sectors, which areas we are engaging in. Now, one thing is sure, the 2017-18 years of establishing this new partnership, elevating it in a much higher level, and rolling out this extremely massive assistance program is like an old glory now. We can't really live on old glories. We got to see how this could be preserved for the future. I know and understand we are under extremely special circumstances with this COVID-19. And we are trying to deliver as much support as possible, but we also got to keep in mind that the world will not end by the time we win this fight. There will be a future, so we will also have to be doing planning for our future, EU, African Union partnership, post-Cotonou era. And I think it's important that also the country as a whole do not only focus on fighting the pandemic, but still keeps on high priority the overall, the strategic issues, the overall democratic changes, constitutional reform, legal reform, SSR, security sector reform, all included. Of course, it is ever difficult, because if it was difficult without COVID, it's now even more difficult. But I think it's important that we work out smart solutions, because I don't want to be the bad news today, but if we really realistically look at where we are, 11th of May 2020, we can say that until we have a vaccine, and the vaccine is manufactured in zillions of doses, and those are distributed to all over the world, to each and every corner of the planet, until we have that, we will have to live with the virus.
Absolutely. I mean, I've just quoted the regional director that it will probably go on for a few years, for several years at least. But how would you respond to this? Most of your support, they go into projects. You support projects here, and we've also seen that in the past, once that support is gone, because normally with projects they are time bound. Once that is gone, that area falls back into dilapidation. Nobody would care about it. So the long-term solution is not there. In other words, you're here for kind of damage limitation. It's all quite ameliorative, which is not bad at all, but to prepare us for kind of self-dependence, self-sufficiency, perhaps for us to start our little industries. I do often hear that around 1994, the Gambia, when Sadar Kadaba was in power, he and China, they were about to start what they call the Gateway Project, to start little industries, stuff like that. We are not getting these things from the European Union or anybody else for us to be self-sufficient. Rather, we'll just be around this dependency, this cycle of dependency, because of the very nature of your intervention, your interaction. How do you respond to that?
Well, first of all, by saying you are very right. Every country has to be very cautious about how they plan their development. There is no country in the world which became a developed country by development assistance. Talking about projects and your reference to projects, this whole package of 365 million, one third of it, 30%, is budgetary support. That's why it's extremely important to make sure that the government receiving it, they really use it for strategic issues. And that is to make sure that this reform process is completed. When I speak about reform process, I do not only think about constitutional reform or legal reform. I'm thinking about reforming the entire shape of the country, in the sense that the Gambia becomes an attractive target for foreign investment. The Gambia becomes more business friendly. Therefore, the necessary capital any government will need in the future will be available by the different taxation and different revenues the government collects. I believe this window of opportunity, which is open, which has been open now, is a golden opportunity for the Gambia to really convert it into a small paradise of investors. I do believe there is nothing, the potential is there for the Gambia to become a little Singapore of the region, for example.
Oh, we've been dreaming about this for God knows how long.
Well, I
in the
think
days of South Africa, we've been talking about the Singapore thing.
Perhaps a bit more than just dreaming is needed here. But on the other hand, Gambia can certainly enjoy a huge degree of respect and assistance, all sort of assistance from all around the world, because of the democratic change and the peaceful manner of the democratic change Gambia could show to the rest of the world.
Absolutely, but before then we need to flatten the curve. When we look at our preparedness, as it were, be it the testing, be it the treatment centers and isolation, as they say, test, you have to test all the time, trace, isolate and treat. When it comes to all these different areas, I would like to think that you've looked at what's going on. What do you make of our state of preparedness?
Well,
in this area?
It's bitter to say, but there was no country on the world
obviously
which was prepared for the challenge.
But okay, so let's say the response. Given that this has happened, now what's going to be your response strategy, at least? Our response to this crisis. Certainly nobody was prepared, but different countries responded differently.
If I look at from the European Union perspective, I can say that indeed the Gambia was also unprepared for it, ill-equipped with a national health system. But if you look at the past 2 months, or since mid-March, let's say, when preparations kind of started, I could see that there was a national plan drawn up, which then proved to be not necessarily the most suited, and now there are ongoing efforts to realize a master plan. If you look at the capacities, I remember the first meeting we had with MRC, the Gambia, where we learned what is the bedding capacity of the country, which was in the range of 30 plus at that time, whereas now it has increased. The question the bottom line question is whether this capacity building can be successfully completed by the time the pandemic reaches its peak. And I think this is also a challenge in the sense that, on one hand, building the capacity is a challenge in itself, but it's progressing. The difficulty comes with the fact that there is no really reliable prognosis as to when the pandemic would reach its peak and what that peak would be. There are some prognoses, I know. There are some scenarios built up. Best case scenario, 15,000 transmissions or confirmed cases. Worst case scenario, 180,000.
Yes.
The question is whether this curve of increase of transmission, whether this curve is sharp or this curve is somehow flattened, which may last longer, but perhaps puts less stress on the health system. One thing is sure, even if some figures are not that frightening at the moment, and we keep hearing better news from this and that part of the world, I do believe focus and emphasis on building these capacities in country should not be slowed down, shall continue, because the country is not yet at a stage of being really prepared for tackling the challenges. If you look at the number of tests so far performed, it is also a huge difference from what we could talk about a good month ago. A number of test kits have been arriving, and I think this is also a capacity building process which needs further advancement. I hear somewhat contradicting news here and there as to how are the different health facilities established in the different referral centers up country, what are the capacities of their isolation rooms. We of course trust government announcements, and we also
But you haven't managed to see
eye.
for yourself, or is just what you get from government?
Actually, I only visited the MRC facility here for the time being, but we also keep an eye on what different other partners' assessments are suggesting. And that's why I said at the beginning that I think this is still an ongoing process. What is good news in this is that the government has got financial means available for sponsoring these activities. If you look at the COVID fund, out of 500 million, some 160 million being spent so far. So there is also a big chunk amount of money available for sponsoring these capacity buildings, purchasing kits or whatever the item is or the activity is. And there are some other fundings coming, including the budgetary support from the European Union. Unfortunately, before the crisis, we didn't have a project in the health sector, which would have been easy to kind of reorientate. We didn't have that. Therefore, for us, I think what we felt like doing is dispersing budgetary support to make sure that the government has got the financial means necessary.
Quite reassuring, your confidence in our government. With us, of course, in dealing with the epidemiology is one thing. The socio-economic stuff quite another. We know that about 80-85% of people really work in the informal economy. And some of these controlling measures we're taking to contain the spread of the virus would be devastating, absolutely devastating. So we wonder, is there any special package? I mean, when you give us your aid or your support, do you make any stipulations as, you know, this amount must be spent perhaps on people, ordinary people, to help them? What do you think? Any help to deal with that?
Regarding the consequences on the social economic consequences of the pandemic, we are also gearing for that. No surprise that the bigger chunk of the budgetary support foreseen for August comes in August. Also because by then we will have a clearer picture as to where really these funds should go. But beyond that, we also have different project interventions where we support certain aspects of these socio-economic consequences. Just lately, we made announcements of supports here and there in different projects, be it the breast project for supporting lactating mothers and such families, or the UNOPS feeder road construction project, where we hire more and more local labor, so they would have an income, they would have a job to do during these difficult times. These are all important. Very soon we will be launching, actually tomorrow I think, so perhaps I shouldn't talk about it now. We are launching a very ambitious project with the Gambia Chambers of Commerce and Industry, the voice of the Gambian business, also via them to support different industries, creative industries, for example, in the field of tourism, to make sure that those capacities which are now unused since the tourist season got cut and nobody knows what's going to happen with the next tourist season. Nevertheless, those actors in those sectors, they still receive support so they can build their resilience. It's extremely important that when it comes to spending on different activities, capacity building, etc., to look at the global picture and do not narrow this response effort down to response to the crisis, the health crisis component, because this is much bigger, much larger than just that.
Absolutely. For us now, perhaps the fear would be this. I mean, we are hearing all these wonderful pledges and the help you're going to give us, absolutely. But again, many things will depend on the politics in Europe. I mean, the cost of what you're going through now, and it's going to be your population, your voters who are going to pay for it. Some people are afraid that this cost of the looming depression, some people are calling it, would feed into right-wing politics. And when that happens, never mind what they call the Brussels bureaucrats. Now I'm beginning to sound like a Tory Brexiteer in Britain. Never mind what you do, depends on the population, what do they want. So we are also facing that uncertainty, whether the help that you've been giving us, it depends.
It very much depends on politics, of course. On the other hand, I do believe, especially now during this COVID crisis in Europe and in European member states, it was also an opportunity of displaying an amazingly impressive degree of solidarity. And I think celebrating solidarity among European member states, it's somewhat symbolic, because it is indeed this year, 9th of May, last Saturday, when we celebrated the 70th birthday of the European project, which became by now the European Union. And if you look back what Robert Schuman, the then French foreign minister, in his declaration, what he called for, unity, solidarity, peace, I think those words, those noble objectives are resonating today. And as I see with the new commission, came to force last December after the elections, this new commission is indeed making every effort to forward this solidarity. And keep in mind that we are going to have a new budgetary cycle. You know, the European Union works in 7-year budgetary cycles called multi-financial framework, and the new framework are to be presented by the end of the year in consensus with member states. Now, if I listen to the voices from Brussels and member state capitals, I see a good chance for reviving this solidarity, which is a very cornerstone of the European Union. And
true, but recently we can hear from Italy or Spain beginning to question, everything would fall apart. And we've even heard from Germany, the development minister, Gerd Müller, saying that, was it the 85 partners or whatever, now reduced to 60. So there would be some cuts. And we would be affected, because already we know that within the European Union, even the northern states, those who are more powerful, the Germans, the Netherlands, they're having difficulty having to bail out, perhaps once again, the southern ones. So even within Europe, there are these difficulties. I mean, what chance for Africa?
Well, there are difficulties, of course, because every negotiation of budget is probably the most difficult thing to do in any government cycle. In that sense, we are in the period when the European Union budget will be decided. In that process, of course, every member state will have to represent their views and make it very loud to be convincing. On the other hand, the degree of solidarity the same member states expressed, which means that the new budget will have to come with a recovery facility, so to make sure that the European Union collectively addresses the impact of the COVID pandemic, also proportionate to what extent the different member states were affected. I think that principle is very vocal. One of the cornerstone of the new multi-financial framework is that the European Union wishes to maintain very strong partnership with partnering countries, including those countries in Africa, of course Gambia included. Let me also refer to the fact, because these European announcements in Brussels are not just an announcement by a single individual, they represent a collective decision of the European Union member states.
It's just that now we are in a crisis, and how would the post-crisis look like? So we should, African countries really, who depend on your support, we should start thinking like that perhaps sooner or later, because of your circumstances, the support that's been coming may not come in the future. So we prepare and know realistically what to expect. That's really I'm teasing, trying to draw one.
I tell you frankly, I of course encourage every Gambian, every partner countries, and especially the Gambian government, the Gambia as a whole, to think about how to go about the future development of the country, regardless what the European Union can contribute to it. But on the other hand, I am frankly not really worried about having a fundamental change in terms of European Union policy vis-à-vis the partner countries, African countries. Keep in mind that this year is very significant also in the sense that we were supposed to have, and we will have to have, the African European Union summit, which will really determine the future. As you know, the cooperation was based on the Cotonou Agreement, which came to an end this year, so there will be a post-Cotonou era. I think these negotiations are also those opportunities where the two sides can really discuss how to go about it. The European Union feels that, especially Africa, we are so interdependent. The European Union feels that this cooperation must be maintained and further enhanced. The question
include debt relief. You know, a lot of people are talking about debt relief right now because we're spending so much in debt payments. You know, the interest on debt payments. So would that be?
Was one of the first saying that a general debt relief for the least developed countries got to be, as a matter of principle, accepted. In the Gambian case, the problem is that Gambia is not indebted to European Union or its member states. Gambia's creditors are someplace else, in the Gulf and elsewhere. So the Paris Club cannot do much about it. Nevertheless, the European Union was and is still very vehement to demanding a global debt relief for all the countries heavily indebted.
Yes, some people are saying that why not we have a sort of Bretton Woods moment after the Second World War, kind of a Marshall Plan kind of thing.
Absolutely.
For Africa. Would the EU, for instance, push for that?
Actually, the EU currently is pushing for a sort of recovery plan, primarily for the EU member states at this stage, because they also believe the unprecedented crisis and the economic consequences are so deep and serious that we got to have a sort of 21st century Marshall Plan. I believe it is up to the EU, African Union, European Union summit and the different minister level discussions to discuss how to go about the recovery for the African economies. One thing is sure, for the European Union, Africa is like the second neighborhood. You know, in our policies, the neighborhood are those flanking countries neighboring the geographical border of the European Union. Africa is like a second neighborhood. We are so much interconnected, we are so much interdependent. Not least, look at the Gambia. Europeans love the Gambia. You have a lot of European tourists. So we are so connected. There got to be a solution. Now, this solution, of course, got to be aligned to what's possible. I mean, I would like to do this or that, but if I don't have the financial means for that, I may be restricted as to what I can do. What I can assure you here and now, and all the viewers,
is in less than a minute. Yes, please, in less than a minute.
The European Union is eager to make sure that this partnership will be continued. We have every intention to do so. And frankly speaking, as we sit here today, I don't see dark clouds on the sky which would threaten the future cooperation between the Gambia and the European Union.
On that happy note, we'll have to end it. I mean, talking about terrorism, heaven only knows what's going to happen after this crisis. What tourism, where the people would want to even fly. No, nobody knows what's going to happen next.
We will have a test case because the summer comes in Europe, and we will see how tourism in Europe under COVID circumstances would be possible. I think that would also be a lesson to take and learn from when it comes to the next tourist season here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Attila Layosh, for joining us on the Viewpoint today.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Ramadan Kareem.
Yes. Thank you very much, viewers, for joining us on the Viewpoint. I almost said there, drive time. I do radio. I'm sure you will understand. Until next time, I am Mamadou Mbodj. Bye-bye.